Howdy doody everybody, and welcome back to my journey across the United States, where we're talking about everything from cryptids to ghosts to downright ridiculous folklore that's scattered across America. Today, we're visiting Ohio, the Buckeye State. Now, because I was born here, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to spend a lot more time here, and we're making this video a three-parter, covering the cryptids, ghost stories, and other folklore of Ohio individually, because otherwise this might be a 3-hour video on its own. In this video, we're going to start off with the hauntings of Ohio, and before I get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder that it'd help this little channel out a lot if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and left a comment saying hi. None of this will ever cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to tell YouTube that my little channel is worth watching. With that out of the way, let's dive into the hauntings of Ohio. Quickly, before I jump into this, I just want to warn my viewers that there are some disturbing stories here. Ghosts require people to pass away, and the way people pass away is generally not pretty. If you're young, sensitive, or otherwise questioning if you should watch this, maybe consider saving this video for a later date or never at all. I don't want to ruin your day. Anyway, if you don't like cemeteries and you want to skip around to haunted places or other haunted sections in this video, just look at the video's timeline or the description. I've labeled things, and this is a 1-hour plus video, so you can skip around to your heart's content and watch what you want to watch. With that out of the way, we're going to start by covering places where you're supposed to find the deceased. Cemeteries. Sure, cemeteries are creepy, I agree, but if ghosts are indeed real, that's where you'd want to find the ghosts, right? I mean, that must be why they always put steel fences up around cemeteries, right? Because they're haunted, and steel is said to ward spirits. No other reason I can think of, at least, that's for sure. But regardless, we're going to start by covering Stoney Creek Cemetery, a cemetery where something extremely creepy happened in 1825 that supposedly leads to an ongoing haunting in the state. Now, while the story is posted online a few places, and it claims to be set in Adams County, which is in the southern part of Ohio bordering Kentucky, there is no Stoney Creek Cemetery in Adams County, period. I've found a few folks other than me have run into this issue, and this has generally led folks to believe that the story is actually set in Stone Chapel Cemetery in West Union, Ohio. I'll list the coordinates on the screen for you here. Frankly, it's not really much. If you look it up on Google Maps, you'll see it's a little gated cemetery. It's got a few trees growing on the side of it, and next to the cemetery, there's a building associated with it at 500 Compton Hill Road. It really isn't much. Despite this, one of these quaint little trees on the property was said to have been the final resting place of someone in 1825. Apparently one morning, the caretaker of the cemetery wandered out to tend to it when they found, at the base of one of the trees, a body of a young man. Now, the caretaker, in response to this, did the responsible thing, and he followed up with law enforcement, and frankly, it wasn't hard to figure out how the young man passed away once law enforcement did arrive, because the young man was missing his head. Add to this that there wasn't any blood at the scene, and the police thought this act must have occurred elsewhere, with locals perpetuating the myth that it was actually a specter of the cemetery that ended up ripping the head from a body, and that might have been while he was bloodless. Though, of course, all of this was unverifiable. Regardless, because the body was headless, police couldn't identify the young man, and sadly, the case went cold for approximately all eternity. Locals, however, say there's one more lead, and if you're brave, you can follow up on it yourself. They say that under one of the trees in the cemetery, if you arrive on the right night, you might find the specter of the young man lingering, perhaps even waiting for you to show up and converse with him, hoping that someone will aid his identification and bring him the closure that he and his family deserved and wanted back in the 1800s. Next up, we've got a story that involves not just one, but rather 5 cemeteries that apparently act together to create some sort of supernatural hub. Around Athens, Ohio, there's a phenomenon that locals refer to as the cemetery pentagram, which is to say 5 cemeteries, Hanning, Hunter, Metheny, Peach Ridge, and Sims Cemetery can be connected on a map to form the shape of a pentagram, a symbol that many associate with supernatural and perhaps even demonic powers. Sims Cemetery is the northmost point on this cemetery pentagram, and because of this, it's said to be imbued with supernatural activity that can rival anything else in the United States. Now, to describe Sims Cemetery, it's said that it was founded by one Johnny Sims, not to be confused with Johnny Sins, and of course he's buried here with his family. Now Johnny may as well have been Johnny Sins because he had one heck of a job. He was a hangman, I kid you not, which is to say he was literally the individual you see in movies who would cover someone's face, rope them up, and pull the lever, allowing them to drop down to their demise when they'd been convicted of a crime. Nasty stuff. It's actually speculated that the old hanging tree that Johnny used to use was actually located on the cemetery grounds that he was buried in. There's apparently a tree on the property that has distinct marks from rope burn on one of its branches. Some say this could have simply been from a tire swing, but others insist it's proof that the hangings Johnny perpetuated were done right on the cemetery property. Now all of this adds up to a haunted cemetery. Folks have visited or even drove by the place at the right time of night, and they've reported seeing full-bodied apparitions on the property. One common apparition seen is that of a borderline translucent man gently hanging from a tree and swaying in the night. Visitors have also reported cold spots, and notably the sound of rope quickly tightening followed by moans. And perhaps the scariest, the speculated ghost of Johnny Sims himself. The most common apparition on site is that of a man wearing a long hooded shroud that slowly wanders the graveyard, but is also perfectly willing to give chase to any late night trespassers. So, if you're an American, whether you're from the South like me, or maybe the Midwest or New England, you've probably heard a ton of Civil War ghost stories, and Camp Chase Cemetery falls right into that category. Now, this place wasn't always a cemetery. During the Civil War, it was actually a prison camp maintained by Union forces, and as prison camps generally are, the conditions were terrible. Most of the passings weren't executions, but rather due to disease and a lack of food that led to starvation. And when people passed away, rather than ship them home, they buried them right on site. So the Union sort of inadvertently made this a cemetery, I suppose. Regardless, it's not hard to imagine that meeting your end in this way might lead to a spirit that's unwilling to rest. Now, weirdly enough though, the most common specter in the cemetery isn't one of the soldiers, but rather a young woman that's often reportedly dressed in a Civil War-era traveling suit. She always looks reverent, with her head bowed like she's weeping, and when people see her, they're often struck with sadness. They see this woman walking among the graves and trees of the cemetery, especially at night when the cemetery's gates are locked shut. Her most common haunt, pardon the pun, appears to be that of an unknown soldier buried on the premises, as well as one Benjamin F. Allen, a member of the 50th Tennessee Infantry Regiment Company D. One final note, after this woman is seen, it's said that if you check the graves she was near, you'll often find flowers. This woman has claimed the name of Woman in Gray over the years in reference to her suit. One particular event linked to the Woman in Gray occurred in 1988 when a Civil War reenactment took place at the cemetery, and a handful of guests reported the sounds of a weeping woman that went on for minutes. During this time, guests were of course alarmed, looking for whoever was crying, but they never actually saw anyone actually crying in the cemetery. They point to the Woman in Gray as the culprit behind this. So, have you ever heard the word Woolybooger? Well, I have. See, when I was in the Boy Scouts, I used to go fly fishing sometimes, and a woolybooger is a type of fly fishing lure, which was why I was so surprised to find that there was a cemetery in Ohio with the name Woolybooger. It does sit right next to Big Darby Creek, though, so I guess maybe some fishermen came up with this nickname over time. Now, the name of this cemetery, from what I can tell, is actually Little Pennsylvania Cemetery, if you want to look it up online for yourself. It's a little cemetery nestled in some woods that, frankly, looks beautiful in some of the photos I'm seeing with fall foliage next to it. But frankly, it sounds like there's some weird stuff going on here. And while this cemetery is in my ghosts video, I'm not actually sure it's ghosts that haunt this place. Accounts I found online describe that, in actuality, what's going on here is more of a spooklights story. Apparently, if you're around this spot late at night, you'll see some weird lights, sometimes flashing lights, making their way through the cemetery at night. And sometimes they apparently even come with noises. Folks also apparently report sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature roaming the cemetery grounds at night, with a few entries I found online claiming that it's relatives with the famous orange eyes of the Charles Mill Reservoir that spends some of his time in the nearby woods, but also some of his time in the creek below the cemetery. This would, some people put forward, explain the lights, especially the flashing lights, as Orange Eyes is known to have glowing orange eyes if you've watched my last video. One particular account I found even said they saw orange glowing eyes in the woods following them as they made the perilous choice of walking through this place at night, so maybe there's some credence here. Some individuals also say there's ghosts and even cult activity on site, but these examples are less driven by any particular story and more just general cemetery superstition. The next cemetery we're covering has quite the reputation. Spring Grove Cemetery is actually the largest non-profit cemetery in the whole United States, according to the sources I'm reading. It's apparently gorgeous, and like the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts, it has an entire Sphinx statue among the other statues that it has on site, well-kept ponds, a waterfall on site, and more. In this cemetery, though, there's also a statue of a man, or a bust of the man, meant to let you know what the man buried below it looks like. But his eyes, there's something about those eyes. They're just not right to some people, and that leads to superstition surrounding this place. So, generally speaking, the legend around this cemetery is that we have this statue here, and the legend says that instead of stone eyes being placed inside of the sockets of this bust of the man buried underneath had his actual eyes removed and placed inside of the statue. And frankly, I see why this legend was started. The eyes in the statue are creepy. They're shiny, they're deeply brown, and they look clean, like real eyes. They really do look alive. And it's said that as you wander the cemetery, if you look back to the man, his eyes will always be turned towards you, watching you. One tale I found online even stated that if you come to this cemetery after hours when it's closed, which, by the way, I don't recommend, it's illegal, the statue might even talk to you. In reality, though, the truth of it is these eyes look clean and have a very sharp color because it's simple, they're just made of glass. At least that's what the cemetery claims. And according to those that visit there, there's really nothing else that's scary about the cemetery. In actuality, it's well kept and borderline inviting, if not for the fact that it harbors the deceased. Our next destination is an island off of the coast of Lake Erie, sort of near the modern-day Cedar Point amusement park, if you're familiar, or just about 2.5 miles off of the coast of the city of Sandusky, Ohio. Once again, here the backdrop is the American Civil War, where Johnson's Island, beginning in 1861, played the part of a secluded prisoner of war camp for Confederate officers as well as Confederate privates, political prisoners, court-martialed individuals, and Confederate spies. There are also a few accounts that are in the minority where citizens were imprisoned here that were aligned with the Confederate cause. Ultimately, this all added up to about 15,000 prisoners being held on the island as a result of the conflict. Frankly, the accounts of being a prisoner here didn't seem especially bad. The facility was meant to be comprehensive, with access to fresh water, healthcare facilities, and barracks, but as things go in the northern portion of the United States, the winters here were harsh, and the location of this camp being on Lake Erie added strong winds into the mix. Unintentionally, these harsh winters caused conditions in the camp to degrade because, As we all know, building materials shrink in the cold. This left gaps in the wooden prison walls for wind to rip its way through to the prisoner's skin, and the frozen limestone soil lost its ability to drain, causing latrines to fill with human waste, leading to disgusting conditions. Ultimately, though, with the end of the Civil War, the need for this base disappeared, and in 1865, the camp was closed. That being said, the Confederate soldiers and sympathizers still apparently linger here in the spirits of the approximately 200 prisoners that passed away during their time on the island that were buried in the Confederate Stockade Cemetery that's located on the island. Visitors that are on the island late at night have reported a number of things, most notably Confederate soldiers in their uniforms marching along the tombstones. In particular, there's also one tree on the island that's known to be a common place to see the apparitions of Confederate soldiers marching along, and there's also a tale that dates back to the early 1900s or 1890s that will send a chill down your spine if you believe it. Apparently on the island at the time, there was a resort established, aptly named Johnson's Island Pleasure Resort, and this resort hired a few non-English speaking Italian immigrants. Now, for the most part, it was said that these immigrants were great workers and their time spent at the resort was uneventful, as they were sent to work at a quarry on the island. That is, until one day, a supervisor decided to drop by to check on their progress and caught a few of these non-English speaking immigrants singing Dixie. In the culinary world, there's a common notion that the best bite of a meal should be your final bite of the meal. And the story of the Otterbein Cemetery is, in my opinion, the most fun of all of these cemetery-related ghost stories, and perhaps the most compelling. The story revolves around one ladies' man named James Henry. See, during the 1840s, James was playing the dangerous game of courting two women, and seeing which one gave him the better deal. They were named Rachel and Mary. These two women both appeared interested in marrying James, and he just couldn't choose whether he wanted the prize behind door number 1 or door number 2. This all changed, though, when one night James was riding his horse home and he fell asleep at the wheel, per se. The good news is, horses have built-in autopilot, but when he awoke, he didn't find himself at home, but rather in front of Mary's house. James took this as a sign to make a decision, and he proposed to Mary, who accepted, and they got married. And when they got married, he actually gave her a wedding present, his horse. Now, for quite a while, all was fine and dandy following their marriage. That is until Mary passed away in 1845. Admittedly, I couldn't find what caused her to pass, but the proof of her living can actually be found at Otterbein Cemetery, where her tombstone resides. And this is sort of a sad story at this point. Poor James lost his wife, but I bet you could guess what he got up to after Mary passed away. Yep, he was back at Rachel's doorstep, and before long, he was able to convince Rachel to marry him in 1848, just 3 years after Mary's passing. And I get it, folks don't want to go through life alone. I really can't blame James. That is, until I heard what his wedding present to Rachel was. It was the same horse he'd given Mary as her wedding present. Now, shortly after this second wedding, something weird happened in Otterbein Cemetery. It's said that on Mary's tombstone, the imprint of a bloody horseshoe showed itself. Now this, to James, was a sign that Mary was unhappy that he got remarried, and also perhaps was a sign that he was cursed. And maybe he was, because they say that one night, not long after the horseshoe appeared on Mary's grave, that weird noises could be heard from the Otterbein Cemetery, and weird lights could also be seen. The next day, Rachel had trouble finding Henry, and she went searching for him, only to find him deceased inside of the barn on their property, with the imprint of a horseshoe on his forehead. See, as the story goes, there wasn't anyone else inside of that barn with him when he passed. That is, except for his horse, that he'd given as a wedding gift to two different people. If you're wondering, the horse was absolved of all fault, and the passing was ruled an accident. To this day, you can actually visit Otterbein Cemetery. I'm displaying what I believe is to be its coordinates on the screen here, and if I'm not mistaken, it's in Rushville, Ohio, sort of southeast of Columbus. If you take a walk through this graveyard, you'll see it's no superstition, and in actuality, you can still walk up to Mary's grave and on it will be the red imprint of a horseshoe mark. So if you're in the area, maybe go see it yourself, but I don't recommend staying there at night. You might end up in a barn with a horse. Now we're transitioning from cemeteries to haunted places. Now, I get it, cemeteries are places too, and often, if not usually, they're haunted. But cemeteries are also sort of obvious places to be haunted. Here, we're going to showcase places throughout Ohio where you wouldn't expect to see a ghost, and where there are ghosts instead, such as inns, theaters, libraries, and even dorm rooms at college. No matter where you're traveling, it doesn't seem like Ohio is spirit-free. In 1800, the Wickerham Inn was erected by one Peter Wickerham in Adams County, Ohio, and it was basically a place where the drivers of stagecoaches would stop and have a nap and maybe some mead before proceeding on their way the next day. It also played a part in the Underground Railroad, transporting slaves to places where there would be free individuals back in the day. At one point, it also, ironically enough, housed Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. All of this is to say, a lot of folks passed through the inn, and some of them didn't have the good fortune to leave the next morning. Perhaps the best-known case of someone checking in and not checking out is one story where a stagecoach driver checked into the inn, and after a few drinks, he started bragging to fellow patrons that he'd had quite the haul, and therefore he had a good chunk of change on him. Drunkenly, after he was done bragging, he took himself to bed, but the folks down at the bar hadn't let him leave their minds. They still were thinking about him and all of that money he was talking about. Now, checkout time came and went the next morning, and the inn employees started to get concerned because they hadn't seen this guest, the stagecoach driver that was bragging so much the prior night, and one employee got sent up to his room. And then the employee knocked a few times, and then they let themselves in when nobody answered, and then they screamed. See, when they entered the room where the stagecoach driver was supposed to be, he wasn't there, but instead there was blood everywhere. In fact, there was actually supposedly the entire bloody imprint of a headless body on the floorboards. Now, Peter got wind of what happened here, and he didn't want this passing to influence his inn's reputation, so according to the story, he ordered the employees to burn the bedding, the curtains, and the bloody outline. The bedding and curtains went just fine, but the bloody stain on the wooden floor was less easily removed, and apparently they just had to replace the whole floor. Now, this isn't where it ends, though. Despite getting rid of the evidence, apparently this stagecoach driver left a piece or two of himself behind, because shortly after his passing, curious teens started reporting seeing a headless man standing by the upstairs window of the Wickerham Inn. And if that's not creepy enough, there's one more thing I have to share with you. Stories like this are often just that, stories with no real credence behind them. No death certificates, no bodies, nothing. That's not the case here, though. In the 1920s, some work was being done on the inn to install heating, and this required the stone floor of the inn to be removed. As the story goes, one worker pulled up a panel of the stone floor, only to find a skeleton. A whole human skeleton. That is, except for the skull. There's a theater in Cleveland that was once so well known that it hosted names like Elvis Presley and the Beatles. Opening in February of 1966, the original Agora Theater was an immediate success, and it was even briefly considered the most influential concert club in the entire USA. And to this day, it still operates, albeit in a new location on Euclid Avenue in downtown Cleveland, that is actually even older, starting as the Metropolitan Theater in 1910, and now bearing the name Agora Theater, after its original location was damaged by fire. This location has played host to everything from concerts with big-name artists to niche bands, and it was even briefly a movie theater named the Hippodrome, which is a name you'll hear again soon, and to this day it's considered a great music venue still. But in addition to hosting events, it's also apparently host to a few spirits. Now, as you know, this is a theater, which means there are stages, and where there are stages in haunted places, you can count on seeing full-bodied apparitions performing. In this case, folks claim to see the apparition of a man in a yellow raincoat frequently making his way across the stage. He's also apparently been seen wandering the balcony and going up the stairs to the balcony. One of his most famous sightings was by some less than reliable witnesses who were apparently doing some, ecstasy. And then they dropped their ecstasy, and then while they were picking up their ecstasy, they looked up to see the judgmental face of a man wearing a yellow raincoat staring at them. In the basement of the theater, there is also a room that's purpose is to allow employees to relax and wind down a bit during a hard shift, but from the pictures I'm seeing, it doesn't look like this is the spot to relax, and employees indicate a similar feeling. According to them, the, in quotes, vibes are off here, and folks spending time here have felt cold spots, the touch of invisible hands, and have even heard voices calling their names when they're alone in this room that is clad in bricks. Apparently, even the seats in this theater are haunted. Janitorial staff and other employees cleaning up after a show have reported to look into the stadium seating and see individuals sitting and watching, and sometimes they've even seen them clapping. In one account, a photographer actually saw individuals in the seats and made it a point to thank them for staying behind with them while they finished up their work, only to see these individuals disappear before their eyes. Now, if you want to visit this theater, it's very much still in operation. You can buy tickets to a show if you want, or probably even just walk in if you come at the right time. That being said, don't expect a relaxing trip to the theater. From what I can tell, the folks here want anything but rest. Akron is a relatively moderately sized town that nowadays has a population of nearly 200,000 and is perhaps better known for Akron University these days. The town was founded in 1825 and became a city in 1865, and at one point, a businessman named L. Oscar Beck planned a project known as the Hippodrome, hence what I said in the last entry here, which was intended to be a 3,000-seat theater with stores inside, a restaurant, and even more. But despite starting construction in 1919, the project went bankrupt in 1921, and it just kind of sat around in the state it was left at until 1925, when a man named Marcus Lowe visited Akron and decided the old Hippodrome would make the perfect spot for his new theater. Originally, the Akron Civic Theater was opened as Loews Theater, named after the new founder, and it has the accolade of being only one of 5 remaining operational civic theaters that were designed by John Eberson, a famous Austrian-American theater architect. Now, despite the fact that the theater is nearly 100 years old at this point, it's very much still in operation, and I could right now purchase tickets for an event this weekend if I wanted to. That being said, if I attended the theater, I might see something a bit spooky for my taste, and if you believe the local legends about the place, the theater is actually haunted by a trio of ghosts. The most well-known of these ghosts goes by the name of Fred. He's the mainstay among the ghouls that haunt the place, and apparently he's an ex-employee who folks report remains a diligent and passionate worker even beyond the grave. Fred was a janitor at the theater, but during one of his shifts he actually passed away, and then apparently refused to move on. Employees at the theater report that you've got the best chance of seeing Fred if there's a mess in the bathroom, and if you're one of the folks that created the mess, you might be legitimately attacked by Fred. Don't worry though, if you're just in there to go number 2, he doesn't mind that, but you better not be causing trouble, because if you are, you'd best watch your back. It's said that he has no tolerance for folks that disrespect his former employer, and I guess perhaps maybe his present employer, at least in his mind. There's also a ghost that's said to haunt the balcony of the theater. You'll know you're in the presence of this ghost if you run into a man that's dressed in an appropriately black tuxedo on the balcony. He might even be holding a cocktail. Details about the specter are slim, and from what I can tell, nobody's gotten a name for him or anything, or even speculated about his past, but it's said that occasionally some trouble is caused on the balcony, and when that happens, folks tend to blame this apparition, named the balcony ghost. Finally, there's another specter that isn't really in the theater, but rather patrols the lock around it. Lock 3 of the Ohio and Erie Canal, to be precise. Now, this canal carried freight traffic until the early 1860s, and then it was abandoned in 1913 prior to the opening of the theater. Tragically, at one point, it's said that a young woman actually lost her way and hopped into the canal to her demise. And these days, this leads folks to see the apparition of a young woman at night walking along the edge of the canal and sometimes jumping in. Folks often report seeing this young woman disappear into the tunnel underneath the theater, crying. Next, we travel from Akron to Miami, and we take a quick stop at the dormitory on the campus of Miami University of Ohio. The Miami University of Ohio is located in Oxford, Ohio, and it was founded in 1809 as the second oldest university in Ohio and the 10th oldest public university in the entire country. And at one point, it was extremely prestigious, so as to be considered among the public Ivy schools, in that it offered a quality of education comparable to those of the Ivy League, like Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, Brown, Cornell, Columbia, and Penn. The roots of Miami University actually go all the way back to President George Washington, who at one point made the statement that an academy should be built that was northwest of the Ohio River in the Miami Valley. Now, our stop on Miami University's campus is Reid Hall, named after a former student from the class of 1856, Whitelaw Reid. He was a diplomat, a journalist, and he even ran for vice president at one point. Now, Reid Hall obviously didn't make this list because of its historical significance, but rather because of the grisly events that took place there in 1959. Quick warning, if talks of gun violence bother you, I recommend skipping to the next part of this video. Okay, well, I'm moving on. In short, there was a fight between two men in Reid Hall. They both lived there, and one of them had a pew-pew. The resident advisor, or basically the guy who lives in a dorm and has the job of maintaining order, jumped in to stop the fight, but the guy with the pew-pew pew-pewed the resident advisor, who was named Roger, and Roger didn't make it. While he laid there passing, though, he reached for a wooden door, and apparently he left a bloody handprint on the door. Now, the pew-pewer was full of regret, and he ran to another hall named Ogden Hall, and, well, there he pew-pewed himself. It's said that despite the fact that this fight was short-lived, the evidence of the scuffle remained for a long time. Apparently, while Reid Hall was still standing, the handprint that Roger left was still stained on the door, and remained there faintly visible for nearly 48 years if you believe the stories. Now, following this event, Reid Hall developed a reputation for being one of the most haunted places on campus. Not only were there the grisly handprints that were still faintly visible on the door they were left on, but according to some former residents, folks reported strange noises in the building too. Sometimes, specifically in the area where this tragedy took place, yelling could be heard. And on one report I found, sometimes, at the exact time that this incident occurred, you could hear a loud boom occur that rattled through the halls of Reid Hall. Something everyone could agree on, though, was that the building was, at the very least, extremely creepy to live in, knowing what had happened there. Now, Reid Hall, as it was, no longer stands. It was torn down in either 2005, 2007, or 2008. I can't really tell. I've seen 3 different reports of when it was demolished to make room for the Farmer School of Business, which rests on the same plot of land, and a new Reid Hall was built on the university's common area, which luckily does not share any of the ghostly history with the old Reid Hall. If you thought this story was over, though, well, I have some bad news for you. The evidence is obviously scarce, but I found one account on a Miami alumni forum stating that they heard a loud argument in the Farmer School of Business one night around 10 p.m. as they were wrapping up work in their office. And when they opened the door to the room that this was occurring in, well, they found nothing but an empty room that was dead silent. Well, if you thought we were done with universities, I have bad news for you. We're still at one. Have you heard of a muskie? Yes? No? Well, at first I thought it was some sort of dog, but as it turns out, a muskie is actually a nickname that Muskingum University alumni and students refer to themselves as. Their sports teams are known as the Fighting Muskies too, which I find kind of fun. But anyways, Muskingum University is a private Christian university located in New Concord, Ohio. It was chartered in 1837, and it's been continuously enrolling students ever since. Now, when I think of universities, I generally expect a haunted dorm room or two, or maybe a weird story about one floor of the school's library having weird stuff going on, but Muskingum University seems to have a problem on its hands because, according to the sources I'm reading, there are 6 haunted structures on campus, or at least haunted places. According to stories, the most haunted spot on campus is a place called Patton Hall. This dorm was built in 1922 specifically to house women, as the first on-campus dorm the college offered. This was aside from more townhouse-like accommodations that they used to accommodate the accelerating enrollment of students in the school. The hall was named after the wife of the president of the university at the time, and to this day, the old dorm hall stands. Now, these days, men and women are both allowed to enter and live in and be afraid of the building, but that doesn't change the fact that those that live there are haunted by the spot's less than savory past. If you believe the stories, a woman named Denise once dwelled in the building. Denise wasn't just a student either, but the resident assistant living there and sort of managing the floor she lived on, making sure students weren't up to no good. She lived on the 3rd floor, in a room which isn't identified, but apparently she was having a tough time with her coursework and took it very personally, and, well, she ended herself because of it. Now to this day, students that live on the 2nd floor report occasionally hearing footsteps and gasping above them late into the night when nobody should be awake, and students on the 3rd floor report this gasping and walking around to occur next to them. People outside also sometimes see a light flickering on and off at night inside of this building, and when it does, they've occasionally reported seeing someone swinging or maybe hanging inside of one of the rooms. Generally, the prevailing thought on this matter is that Denise is still wandering the building and that she's the cause of the unexplainable noises and strange phenomena witnessed by students to this day. Next, on Muskingum's campus, there's a spot called the Hollow. Frankly, that's a great name for a haunted place, but most of the activities there aren't haunted per se. Located on the north side of campus, sort of near the baseball and football fields and the university's Kelly Hall, there's a patch of woodland that the university itself cheerfully labels as an area that provides a space for folks that want to venture into the woods for a minute, and it recommends folks to camp there, hold bonfires, or just go for a walk or a jog. Despite this, students claim that more is afoot in the Hollow than the university lets on. Now, the accounts of this online are few and far between, but according to ohioexploration.com, folks that have walked through the Hollow at night have reported that sometimes the pathway you're on might become flooded with mist, and if you're there when this occurs, you might be met with the sight of a full-bodied apparition. For what it's worth, one account I saw on Facebook actually claimed that this happened to them, and the apparition tried to tell them something, but admittedly I've only seen this once, so take it with a grain of salt. There's also another hollow named Stumpy's Hollow in Norwich, which I've seen conflated with this hollow, and frankly I'm not sure what the truth is, but apparently one of these hollows is haunted by a dog, and when it's roaming around, it looks like a normal dog, but if you call it, it'll turn to you and it'll have a human face. Some legends even claim that this man-faced dog might start speaking to you. Admittedly, I'm pretty sure this legend only pertains to Stumpy's Hollow, but just in case this is in reference to this hollow, I'll leave it here for good measure. Now I'm not done here. There's also Finney Hall on Muskingum's campus, particularly room 104 of Finney Hall. Often individuals get assigned to live in this room without a clue as to the burden it carries with it, and for a while, they'll happily reside there. That is until one night they might wake up in the middle of the night, only to open their eyes and notice someone is watching them sleep. Often folks think this is an intruder until they turn on the lights and they notice that miraculously the figure has disappeared. If we want to be specific, the accounts I've viewed online generally claim that the specter is that of a woman, but who's to know if this is really the case? Now, in addition to these better documented haunted spots on campus, folks claim that there are ghosts in the campus theater because of odd creaking noises reported by staff and late-night visitors there. There's also Thomas Hall, where people report to feel like they're being watched and objects are known to fly off tables, and in Thomas Hall, there's even reports of seeing shadow people roam through the halls. There's also apparently a ghost in the dean's house on campus, although this report has never been made by the dean himself, but rather by students who claim that when you stand in the middle of this one outdoor theater on campus and you look up at the windows of the dean's house late at night, you'll see the silhouette of a man staring back at you. Hey, who's to say the dean just doesn't have insomnia, though? Now, not to be rude, I'm sure your university is a great place if you went to Muskingum University, but with stories like this, I've always wondered if the setting of a small university, or even a small town which is perfectly fine but doesn't have a ton going on, lends itself to bored minds. And as we all know, bored minds see things, hear things, and imagine things that are a bit different than the occupied mind. I venture to guess that this setting lent itself to young individuals looking for a thrill, and they may have found a thrill in crafting stories of the paranormal. Now, despite this, in this video series, we've visited states throughout the entire USA, and this is surely the most haunted university I've come across so far, at least as a proportion of its size. What do you think, though? Do you think these hauntings are real? Have you experienced them yourself? Let me know in the comments. In Cleveland, specifically at 8615 Euclid Avenue, which I state because otherwise it's kind of difficult to find out this mansion's location, there's an old mansion that's now a foundation house for the Cleveland Clinic. The mansion's over 100 years old, and it was built by Francis Drury, and if you were to go inside of the Drury mansion, you'd find excess and opulence in equal measure, spread across the home's 50 rooms, long hallways, and secret tunnels. On the topic of this secret tunnel, it was actually a late addition to the home, but it runs under Euclid Avenue to the Drury Theater across the street. Over the years, the mansion was home to the Drury family, it was a home for unwed mothers, and it was a boarding house at one point too, prior to its current uses. Now, as you'd expect from an old home that looks a bit reminiscent of the home from Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, the home and its many rooms are claimed to be haunted. But while the Drury family lived in the Drury mansion, there were no reports of odd happenings at all. Rather, it wasn't until the mansion became used by the state as a halfway house for convicts that paranormal activity on the property ramped up. There's a few simple stories there, like folks claiming they felt like they were being watched, hearing footsteps late at night, seeing doors and windows open themselves, and even seeing blinds pull themselves up. But there are also a few more specific stories too. One example of this is a story of a few police officers, which, are people you'd expect to be quite brave, but they were found being quite afraid. Apparently, around the time the Drury Mansion became a halfway house, it was being prepped for its new role and was still vacant, and so police officers were stationed there to guard the home. The night started normally, they arrived for their shift, and the day shift left, but when the morning shift arrived in the morning, they couldn't get in touch with the officers, and so they roamed the premises only to find the two night shift employees back to back in the middle of a room holding their pew-pews, frightened to the point of mania. There's also reports of full-bodied apparitions roaming the home, such as a 1978 encounter where one employee at the mansion saw someone standing on the main staircase. They thought they were alone in the house, so they made their way over to the individual on the staircase that they thought was a woman with her hair tied up, only to find that when this individual briefly left the employee's frame of vision, she disappeared. Since then, this woman that haunts the house has frequently been seen around the home, in the bedrooms, in the kitchen, and even in the home's yard. Nobody quite knows who she is, but folks generally suppose that she was one of the unwed mothers who lived there for a short time. Now, nobody truly knows if Drury Mansion is really haunted, and I guess that applies to pretty much every place on this list, but generally speaking, many folks brush this haunting off as people mischaracterizing the mansion just because it is a Gothic structure and therefore sort of looks haunted. Now, also in Cleveland is Franklin Castle, or the Hans Tiedemann House. This castle is a bit older than Drury Mansion, having been built in 1881, and is sometimes referred to as the most haunted house in all of Ohio. Now, a bit of history and housekeeping first. The castle was built in the Victorian style. It's 4 stories tall, it has a grand ballroom inside, and it's frankly just huge with 20 rooms in it. The property even has its own carriage house. It's named the Franklin Castle simply because it was a castle that was built on Franklin Boulevard, and it was built for one individual, as I said before, named Hans Tiedemann, who was a German immigrant who was doing well financially after founding the local Euclid Avenue savings and trust business. Now, it didn't take long after this castle was built for tragedy to strike the family, and those tragedies would begin haunting the home in 1881. The Tiedemann family mother, Wickerham, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, and Hans' daughter, Emma, who was just 15, passed away first. The mother passed from natural causes, but the daughter was less fortunate and was believed to have passed because of a bout with diabetes-related complications. In the following years, though, I could not find evidence as to why 3 more of the Hans Tiedemann children passed away, and this led locals to speculate that Hans himself may have, at least in part, been to blame. Or perhaps, maybe he was just a bad man. Some sources also claim that Hans' niece also passed away on the premises, but I couldn't find evidence for this claim. This rocky start to the castle's history is perhaps what imbues it with the reputation it has today. Now, apparently after all of these passings in the home, Hans began performing more renovations to distract his wife, who took the passings very hard. This is where the home's turret and gargoyles come from. But also, rumors say that around this time, hidden rooms, tunnels, and passages were built at the home that were used for bootlegging during Prohibition. Eventually, in 1895, just 14 years after the home was built, Hans' wife ended up passing in the home too, at age 57. This prompted Hans to sell the home, and he passed away just 13 years later, leaving no heirs behind. So, let's be clear, the family that bought the home from Hans witnessed nothing strange, and didn't ever report ghosts, or skeletons in their closets, or even hidden passages leading from place to place in the home. They owned the home without any drama before selling it to some members of the German Socialist Party, and for a while, perhaps due to the political climate, this sparked conspiracies that the castle was being used as a base for World War II German factions and spies. That being said, I found no proof of this conspiracy other than some chatter about a shortwave radio being found in the home after the socialists left. Now, the real haunted drama in the home began in 1968 when the socialists sold the home to one Romano family, and it didn't take long for them to notice something was off about the house. It started when the Romano children made a few new friends, and they started telling their parents about them. The parents became concerned, though, when they found out this friend of their children actually lived inside of the house, on the 4th floor, in the ballroom to be precise. At first, the parents thought, oh, this child is imaginary, but this persisted to the point that the kids started asking for cookies for their new friend. The Romano wife also began to hear organ music being played in the home, but upon inspection, they would never find anyone actually operating it. The Romanos actually consulted with a group of ghost hunters because of all of these weird occurrences, and apparently their results suggested a haunting because a ghost hunter was observed running and screaming as he left the home during his investigation. There's even suggestions that a priest was too afraid to bless the castle. Now, if you're rich enough to buy Franklin Castle, you're also rich enough to move, and this is just what the Romano family did, evacuating the home in 1974 and selling it to a family by the name of the Muscatellos. By the way, quick aside, this all does sound like some weird Halloween episode of The Sopranos because of all of these Italian last names, right? But regardless, back to the story. Now, the Muscatellos bought the home knowing all too well that it was rumored to be haunted, and they wanted to milk that cash cow for all it was worth. They invited media, they did radio shows, and they offered tours of the home. During these events, paranormal activity was, of course, frequently witnessed, although frankly, it's stuff that's pretty easy to fake, like ceiling fans spinning of their own accord when turned off, supposedly. There's also whole walkthroughs on YouTube on how to make fake haunted stuff like this, just to be clear. All of this is cheap talk, though, compared to what happened when the Muscatellos were supposedly searching for one of the castle's secret passageways. They apparently found a moonshine still from Prohibition, but while inspecting it, they found there was a panel hidden on one of the home's towers. And when they moved this panel, they found something inside that they didn't expect, a human skeleton. This discovery for many sort of solidified that the first owner of the castle, Hans Tiedemann, was indeed up to no good, and perhaps caused the passings of his many family members. Although some just think that the Muscatello family found and put bones there themselves to push this haunted house narrative they were going for. As for where all of this went, all I can really find online is that the bones were indeed identified as real, but were never identified as any specific individual. All the authorities confirmed were that these bones were indeed old. After this, the Muscatello family ended up selling the home, and it changed hands a few times between this point and 1999, when a man, for whatever reason, tried to burn the castle down, destroying much of the home's ballroom. Following this, there were some renovations, and the home almost became a restaurant club, and then in 2011 it caught on fire again, and then it became a 3-family home for a while, And finally, in 2022, it started offering single-night accommodations for guests. Nowadays, from what I can tell, the castle is a tourist attraction through and through. You can tour it, you can visit it and see its history, and you can even stay the night. But only if you're 16. No kids allowed. The pricing actually ranges from about $170 to $300 a night, so I guess if you're bold, you're welcome to try and contact the ghosts that the Romano family encountered yourself. Also, approximately in Cleveland, although technically in Willoughby Hills, Ohio, is another castle named Squire's Castle. This castle's origin story started in 1890 when a man named Fergus B. Squire, a Standard Oil Company executive that was tight with the Rockefeller family, decided to purchase about 500 acres of forested land east of Cleveland. Fergus's plan for the land was to build a gigantic English-style country estate on it. And this dream started coming to fruition in 1895 when he began constructing a gatekeeper's house, completing it in 1897. This home is the castle we see today. Now, this place was never modernized, even for the time. It didn't have electricity, it didn't have gas or water, or even sewer. It was pretty bare bones. Squires owned the place for a few years, though, but inevitably gave up on his idea of completing the manor house on his new property after he had trouble finding labor and materials for the home. Despite this, the home was used by his daughter for a weekend country home, and Fergus himself visited the house just sometimes, pretty rarely, because his wife disdained the home. Some accounts I found online claimed her disdain for the home was because at the time, Fergus kept a room entirely full of taxidermied animals that he'd hunted, which she rightfully got the heebie-jeebies from. A sight she hated observing as she did her late-night walks through the home, holding a lantern when she couldn't fall asleep. And here's where the ghost story comes. See, apparently Fergus's wife awoke one night from something and went on a walk through the home holding her famous lantern. Some say it was because there was a nasty storm outside, with lightning that shook the house. Others say that she was awoken by a conversation. Whatever awoke her, though, drove her down to the trophy room, where the taxidermied animals were that she was so scared of. And when she got there, whatever it was that woke her scared her again, causing her to take off running away from it. Some stories say this was another bolt of lightning, but others suggest she saw a ghost. Now, whatever it was, in the darkness of night, she missed a step in front of her, causing her to fall headfirst and break her neck. Now, the next morning, it said that Fergus awoke and saw that he was alone in bed, so he went wandering the property looking for his wife, which he found deceased. And in his grief, he gave up the property and moved back to Cleveland, leaving the property behind and never returning. And because of this, it's claimed that sometimes visitors to the castle see a woman with a lantern looking out of the second-floor window, a second floor that no longer exists. Now, if you enjoyed this story, I hate to break the news to you, but while folks have claimed that this property is surely haunted for years by the ghost of Fergus's wife, while the property may indeed be haunted, it certainly isn't haunted by her. It's well documented that she passed away miles away from natural causes, and Fergus sold the property, it seems, simply because he didn't deem it worth keeping, following his manor plans falling through. These days, the shell that was the gatekeeper's house sits empty. The windows, doors, and second floor are removed because of vandalism in the past, and it's now part of the Cleveland Metro Parks system. At least for a while it was heavily vandalized, but in the 1990s it was partially restored, and to this day you can still visit the structure, or I guess the shell of the structure. The funnily named Licking County, Ohio, is home to a spot named the Buxton Inn. This inn was originally known as The Tavern, and it was built in 1812 by one Orrin Granger, a transplant from Massachusetts, and it's been in business nonstop since it was founded. The inn itself, while hard to find photos of, is pretty darn nice with a dining room, a ballroom, and more. The name Buxton Inn comes from its ownership by one Major Buxton, a man who gained ownership of the operation in the mid-1800s. Now, this is a ghost video after all, and when it comes to the Buxton Inn, there are several apparent specters roaming the premises. To start, there's Orrin Granger himself, the founder of the tavern. Sometimes patrons staying the night or stopping by for a beverage have mentioned that either in their rooms or in the hallways on the way, they've seen an elderly man wearing old-fashioned clothing wandering about. Sometimes they've tried to talk to him, particularly when he's in their room and guests want him to leave. And of course, they never get a response. It's also said that Orrin loves to steal pies from the downstairs pantry. Of course, that's the story I'd tell too if I were taking pies from the downstairs pantry. But hey, let's not spoil the fun for those employees. They deserve the pie. Another ghost is said to be that of Major Buxton, the namesake of the tavern. Folks have described him as more of a shadow person than a full-bodied apparition like Orrin, but sometimes people have apparently observed him dining with guests in his old-timey clothing, face out and all. As for how they recognize his ghost, well, it's because his portrait hangs in the tavern's lobby. There's also a woman who haunts the place, referred to as Bonnie Bunnell, who's often called the Lady in Blue, based on the blue dress she so often wears. Miss Bunnell was actually a guest at one point, but at some point in the tavern's history, she was said to have passed away in room 9 of the inn. It's said that before guests see her, they'll often hear the smell of sweet perfume, and then they'll be visited by her. From the accounts I've seen, she's nothing but kind and generally just ignores guests as she goes about her business. Finally, humans aren't the only resident specters lingering in the Buxton Inn. There's also a large gray cat that apparently roams the inn and is actually hung on the sign adorning the outside of the Buxton Inn. Folks who have seen the cat say it simply wanders the halls and sometimes phases through walls into rooms, but generally, the cat specter just acts like a cat. So, who knows, maybe there's a real cat wandering the Buxton Inn, or maybe it's a ghost. What do you think? Now, as for the inn itself, it's still plenty operational. You can visit the Buxton Inn and have everything from a fine glass of wine to a shot of Malort with dinner. You can stay the night at the tavern for somewhat reasonable prices too, and if you're feeling adventurous, you can even have your wedding there. If you actually do decide to have your wedding there, tell them T's Storytime sent you, or maybe don't, they won't know who I am, but I think it would be funny if one of y'all decided to get married there after watching this video. Strangely placed in the middle of Dayton, Ohio's community golf course is a relatively tall tower that goes by many names: Lookout Tower, Frankenstein's Castle, the Witch's Tower, and probably what it's best known as, Patterson's Tower. A lot of the old tower and castle-style structures we've viewed in this video were built in the 1800s, but this one's relatively new by comparison, having been built in 1941. Patterson's Tower is sometimes claimed to have been built by a man named John D. Patterson as a place to live, but in reality, it was built to provide a good view of the golf course to the folks that belonged to the country club it was built on. The tower isn't spectacularly high, it's only 30 feet in height, but luckily the surrounding landscape is pretty flat, so this small increase in height nets you about a 15-mile view. In the 1960s, folks outside of the country club community started to realize this tower existed, and that it was fairly remote, and then they started using it as their personal playground. Folks would come along and tag the place, spray painting it, and they'd drink while they were there, with reports of beer bottles, whiskey bottles, and damage all over the property. The country club tried to counter this by boarding the place up, but this didn't stop vandals from making their way inside and repeatedly damaging it. Ultimately, this sort of behavior is what led to the tragedy that folks claim leaves the tower haunted to this day. Apparently, in the 60s, a group of teenagers made their way to the area the tower was in. I'm not sure what they were doing, probably just being a bit naughty as teens do, and they were hanging out in the area when a storm rolled in. Thinking the stone tower would make a decent refuge from the storm, the kids ran inside of the tower, but when they got inside, a bolt of lightning struck a metal rail that was attached to it. They say that 2 of the teens inside of the tower were actually leaning on this part of the rail that was near the bottom of the tower, and the bolt of lightning passed right through it, and right into the teens, electrocuting them, and, well, you know what happened. Now, this story might sound embellished to high heavens, and I actually thought this story was fake when I first read it, but after doing a bit of digging, there's a newspaper article from 1967 that claims that one Peggy Harmison and Ronnie Stevens, 16 and 17 years old respectively, were actually victims of a lightning strike inside of Patterson's Tower. I'm not sure how, but someone ended up alerting an ambulance when they figured out this happened, and when they arrived, The girl in this situation was found deceased, and the boy, Ronnie, was burnt and, I quote, uncontrollable. Some stories claim that both of these teens passed, but I don't believe this is truly the case. Now, after all of this, the tower still stood, but it wasn't the same. Not only did folks that visited the tower claim they could see the charred outline of the girl imprinted on the wall of the tower, they also claimed that this stain was impossible to remove. Additionally, they claimed that on stormy nights, if you visited the tower and looked towards the top or towards some of the windows, when lightning flashed, you could see the specter of a young woman briefly illuminated. These days, the tower indeed still stands, but due to the accident with Peggy and the repeated vandalism, the tower has been more permanently sealed off by concrete. Some sources claim that the tower was more permanently sealed because more tragedies, like a fall and a hanging, occurred on the premises, but I couldn't find any articles stating this was the case. What remains, though, is a chilling tale of a nearly inconceivable passing by natural causes that continues to prompt those curious about what lies on the other side of that concrete barrier, and when lightning's flashing, what might be dwelling near the top of the barrier. Folks still make their pilgrimage to Patterson Tower to get a look, especially on dark, stormy nights. Frankly, I am very surprised that this is the first formal prison on this list. In Mansfield, Ohio, there is a field that was, starting in 1862, home to a Civil War camp named Camp Bartley. It was a training camp named after Ohio's 1840s governor, and eventually in 1867, Mansfield was elected as the spot for a new penitentiary to complement the existing penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. It took a while to build the prison because of funding delays, but eventually in 1896, the Reformatory opened its doors to its first class of 150 prisoners who were immediately put to work fixing and improving the prison. Now, initially, the prison was known as the Intermediate Penitentiary because it was somewhere in the middle in terms of criminals, between a spot called the Boys Industrial School, which was for young first-time offenders, and the Hardcore Ohio State Penitentiary, which was for hardened criminals. Because these weren't the proper bad boys, they were trying to actually reform them rather than keep them locked away, which is part of why they put them to work. Additionally, the architect that designed this prison, Levi D. Schofield, a native of Cleveland, modeled the prison in Victorian, Gothic, Richardsonian, Romanesque, and Queen Anne styles, which he hoped would inspire inmates to become reborn and adopt spirituality into their lives. It also made the prison look a heck of a lot like a castle. Regardless of all of the optimism that this prison was trying to inspire in the inmates it hoped to reform, there were some bad moments in this prison's history. One of these moments involved the passing of a correctional officer at the prison, one Frank Hanger, and when I say passing, I mean it was caused by another prisoner, during a 1932 breakout attempt where a bunch of prisoners tried to get out and they ended up beating Frank up. There was also an area called The Hole, which was the prison's version of solitary confinement. Apparently the Hole was known for driving prisoners mad, and this madness caused them to want to, end their time in the Hole. This ending of time, in some reports, came in the form of, using a fire on themselves and using rope on themselves, if you catch my drift. Stuff I can't say on YouTube. And in 1957, the Hole actually ended up housing 120 different prisoners for 30 days as punishment for a riot. During this event, there was an instance where 2 inmates were actually forced to live in the same isolation cell in the Hole, and while details are not available about how this horrifying stay went, it's known that only one individual emerged from this cell. Ultimately, whether due to violence or natural causes, 200 men ended up passing away on the premises of this penitentiary. As you might expect, because of this checkered past, the Ohio State Reformatory has gotten a reputation for housing more than a few of its old inmates into modern day. Folks used to go there in the past for bad behavior, but now people generally flock to the old prison to take their chances at observing shadow people, speaking to spirits, and even seeing full-bodied apparitions. One of the most well-known apparitions is a young man that's known to run down the hallways at a rapid speed. He seems ignorant of those visiting the prison, and never reacts to their calls or screams, only running past them, away from them, and sometimes right through them. There also seems to be spirits, or perhaps a spirit, that is still clinging to the violence that embraced the final moments of his life. This spirit is known to strike people and make them feel like they've been punched, and in one case has even thrown someone down a flight of stairs, hurting them. Perhaps most interesting of all of the specters is one that is claimed to have been around even when the prison was in operation. It's apparently on record that both inmates and prison guards alike reported the sensation of having their arms grabbed and pulled while they were resting in the prison, an act that would often wake them up and send them into a fit of terror. Perhaps unsettlingly, this ghost is the same one that visitors to the Reformatory report to help them up stairways these days. It's also often said by old inmates and visitors alike that if you experience this ghost helping hand, or maybe pulling hand, that afterwards you'll soon hear an unbearable wailing penetrating through the halls of the hospital, or you might even see a shadow person running about in the hallways. Some point to this individual as a banshee, a bad omen, signaling the passing of family or those that hear the screams that may have taken up residence inside of the Reformatory because it's a cursed place. These days, if you want to see the Reformatory yourself, you're not just allowed, but sort of invited to try. The Reformatory hosts ghost tours for people of all ages year-round to come into the abandoned hallways of the old prison and try their luck at communicating with those prisoners from long ago. Oh, also, if you're wondering, or if this place maybe looked familiar to you from photos, yes, this is the prison where The Shawshank Redemption was filmed, and yes, they hold conventions regarding the movie here. Pretty cool, huh? Lake Hope State Park is a state park which is actually named for an old mining village, Hope, Ohio, and Hope, Ohio still stands under the waters of Lake Hope in Lake Hope State Park. It was purposefully flooded back in the day to create the recreation area that's there today. You can actually still see remnants of Hope along the Moonville Rail Trail that passes nearby, we'll talk about this in a second, as well as the Old Hope Furnace, which was used in the past to smelt iron, and now holds the name Lake Hope Furnace. And this furnace is the topic of this ghost story. To me, this is a classic setting for a horror story. I can just picture the Boy Scouts sitting around a fire, looking at the Old Hope Furnace in the distance, waiting to see eerie lantern light pass them by. This story and the next both cover a similar topic: loyal workers that refuse to leave their occupation behind even after their passing. See, back in the day, this furnace was no slouch. It was actually turning about 15 tons of cast iron per day on average, and this steady flow of material required constant supervision by watchmen, who kept the furnace operational and the fires hot, and also had the somewhat morbid job of making sure locals didn't wander on site and get too curious of what the furnace looked like from above, causing them to perhaps trip and fall into the bubbling ore. Because of this, it's said that watchmen working at the furnace could be seen pacing around the area, with the glow of orange lanterns accompanying them even in the dead of night. Now, one night, they say that there was only one watchman on duty, and this night was not nice. There was a very big storm brewing, it was pouring rain, and lightning was constantly flashing, keeping the watchman on edge. As the story goes, lightning gradually started striking closer and closer to the watchman, driving the watchman further and further towards the furnace, until, at one point, the lightning struck him, and because of this, whether the lightning got him or not, he fell into the hot ore below him. Admittedly, I haven't been able to find any proof that this tragedy occurred, but that doesn't mean that folks aren't claiming to still see this watchman's ghost wandering the site to this day. Nowadays, those in the area late at night report an orange glow patrols the area around the crumbling Lake Hope furnace. Particularly if it's storming, you're apparently liable to see the silhouette of a man carrying a lantern walking along the top of the furnace, pacing back and forth, until finally a bolt of lightning signals his departure. Only a paltry 2 miles from the Lake Hope Furnace is a section of the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad which made its way towards Cincinnati, Ohio. This particular section was more remote than many along the railroad and actually passed through the area of the abandoned town Hope and some other small, now abandoned mining towns. Along this path, a tunnel was burrowed through a high hill at one point, and where this tunnel exited was a small mining town named Moonville. Now, Moonville wasn't much, and it wasn't much for long, only having a small population which persisted for a mere 30 years. Despite this, the aptly named Moonville Tunnel played host to a number of fatalities over the years, with over 21 people documented to have been struck by a train on the track, the last of which was a 13-year-old girl that wandered on the tracks in 1978, long after Moonville had become a ghost town. Now, as I said, Moonville is no more. What was left behind has mostly succumbed to the elements, leaving only the short train tunnel and the town cemetery behind as relics of what was. And according to some accounts, the folks that were left behind in Moonville consider the town a bit boring for their taste and would rather hang out in the train tunnel with, as we heard about, some of the more recent passings. The following are a few of the ghost stories attributed to the Moonville Tunnel. The first ghost is referred to as the engineer. They claim that his real name was Theodore Lawhead, and he was, as you'd expect, a railroad engineer working for the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad Company. In the 1880s, something horrible happened to him when two trains going the opposite direction collided with one another, and this occurred near the train tunnel. Now, it's said that when you walk the tunnel on the tracks, sometimes you'll see a lantern swaying in the distance being held by a shadowy figure who, if you're lucky, may beckon you to get help because there's been a collision between two trains. There's also the brakeman. This story is simple. The brakeman was a brakeman for the trains in Moonville, and one night he drank a bit much and decided the train tracks were an excellent place for a nap because he didn't think any trains were coming. Well, what do you think happened? Sadly, the brakeman still hasn't seemed to wake up from his nap, as according to one account I saw online, sometimes if you're wandering the place he got struck, which is supposedly just past the Moonville Tunnel towards Cincinnati, you might see the outline of a man taking a nap on the tracks. There's also a man named the Bully, who in life was apparently a man named Baldy Keaton, and a resident of Moonville. As the story goes, Baldy liked to drink, and he liked to fight. He'd apparently bear hug whoever he was fighting to the ground, and one night he decided to employ this bear hug tactic on the wrong guy, and he ended up forcibly passing away on the tracks in the Moonville Tunnel, if you believe the story. Now, they say that if you're approaching the tunnel, you might see a man right on the edge of the light inside of it, staring at you, and he might throw pebbles at you, actually. In the area, it's apparently also commonplace for parents to warn their children that if they stay out too late, the bully will get them. One account I saw on Facebook also claimed that they felt like they got hugged and squeezed when they were wandering inside of the tunnel, and they attributed this to Old Bully. Finally, perhaps the creepiest character on this list is known as the Lavender Lady. She's simply described as a thin, elderly woman that you might see in the distance walking along the tracks, and when she disappears, you'll be met with a thick scent of lavender. Folks think that in life, this woman was one Mary Shea, an elderly woman who wandered onto the tracks of the Moonville Tunnel and was struck by a train. As of 1988, the train line that ran through the Moonville Tunnel was abandoned, and the rails were removed. These days, you can take a ride on the Moonville Rail Trail on your bike or take a walk on foot, and this will take you to the Moonville Tunnel. And you can go in it, because there's no danger, there's no trains anymore. There's actually even a Halloween or ghost-themed festival, apparently known as Midnight at Moonville, that's located on the old railroad bed and in the tunnel that you can attend if you dare. Spencerville, Ohio may only have a population just cresting 2,000 people, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a story to call its own. In 1844, the Miami and Erie Canal was extended into the region, and the city was named for one of the canal planners associated with this extension. Cutting through this town is Route 66, and along this route is a simple bridge that nowadays you probably wouldn't think twice about. But in 1854 was the site of a grisly attack that's recounted on a plaque located just across from the bridge. The story on this plaque tells the tale of a rivalry that formed between two men seeking the love of one woman. Let's keep in mind in an earlier portion of this video we saw the opposite case with two women loving one man. They were much more civil about their endeavor though. In this story though, the woman ended up choosing one of the men, and most would think this ended the feud. But the man, who wasn't chosen, took it personally and decided to surprise the new couple as they were walking home along this bridge. He didn't have a firearm, but he did have an axe, and he had a heck of an arm. And with one good old whip of that arm, he took the head off of his competition, surprising the woman and causing her to fall off the bridge into the water below, where, years later, she was discovered as a skeleton. For some reason, apparently the plaque then ponders whether this was justice. In my eyes, this is just plain and simple savagery. As with every story on this list, though, it doesn't end with the passing of the victims. Folks actually say that if you're standing in the area near this bridge, that sometimes you might see someone late at night who's walking on the bridge. And the closer they get to you, the more you'll realize something's wrong because they're missing something, their head. And God forbid you look down at the water because you'll see something else here too, the face of a woman staring up at you. These days, this bridge has been replaced, but there's still a bridge where the horror took place, so the legend lives on, and this bridge carries the name that folks in the area know it by so well, Bloody Bridge. For real though, you can actually Google Bloody Bridge on Google Maps and even drive over it. And because of this, the bridge has apparently garnered notoriety as one of those spots where bored teens drive to late at night to get their lover nice and afraid and suddenly cuddled ever so slightly closer. In the far eastern side of the state, only 36 miles northwest of Cleveland, there's a public recreation area named Beaver Creek State Park that draws visitors from across the state to enjoy natural beauty, but also to see some of the history inside of it. In this state park, there are remnants of a canal and lock transportation system, which ran from the Ohio and Erie Canal to the Ohio River in Pennsylvania. This portion of the canal was called the Sandy and Beaver Canal, which was established in 1837. Along with the establishment of this canal, there was a town, actually built up in the area, that now houses the state park that went by the name of Sprucevale. This town included a stone grist mill, a locksmith shop, a general store, and a wool factory. And 19 families ended up living in the town because of these amenities. But sadly, only 15 years after the canal was established, there was a reservoir break causing damage that was too expensive to repair in lieu of the growing popularity of rail transportation. Now, this sort of thing isn't great for a town that's reliant on the success of a canal, and this gradually caused the town's collapse and abandonment, becoming totally abandoned by 1870. At this point in time, like right now, only the mill and remnants of brick buildings remain. However, despite this, folks still claim that some of the old residents reside in Sprucevale. One of these residents was actually the infant daughter of one of the founders of Sandy and Beaver Canal, Edward G. Gill. This infant was named Gretchen, and while she and her mother were traveling to Ohio from their home in Ireland, the mother actually passed away to be buried at sea, leaving Gretchen motherless. But as the story goes, Gretchen wasn't far behind. In 1837, the year after Sprucevale was established, she ended up getting malaria, and following cries from her that she wanted to join her mother in her fever-driven delusions, she passed away. Edward Gill, the father, ended up burying Gretchen in one of the canal locks. This story isn't over, though. See, when the canal failed, Edward decided he'd return to Ireland, and he brought his daughter's remains with him to be buried there. But the ship they were on, it sank, sending both Gretchen and her father to the bottom of the ocean. Now, these days, the lock that Gretchen was buried in is referred to as Gretchen's Lock, and it's said that if you come at the right time on the true anniversary of Gretchen's passing, which is said to be August 12th, you can see the ghost of a young woman crying and begging to be buried with her mother. Perhaps that's why their ship ultimately sank at sea. They also say that a bridge in the state park and the old mill are haunted by a hideous apparition, and that if you're touched by it, it will send you to the grave and make the apparition young and beautiful in your place. They say this ghost is named Esther Hale, and there's a lot of confusion surrounding who she actually was in life, with one prominent version of the story claiming she was a stern Quaker preacher. Sometimes, apparently this ghost can even be observed at Gretchen's Lock, causing confusion there as well. Folks generally claim that Esther can be observed most commonly on Christmas Eve in the old Hambleton Mill, and that she may scratch the words, "Come," onto the stone walls of the mill. They say that if you see a misty apparition floating along in this area, you're probably seeing Esther. Finally, there's one final brick building on site, Frankly, I'm not sure about the purpose of it, but they say that a lonesome little boy passed away on this site and that he doesn't like visitors. Because of this, any photos of the building will be fogged over by the boy. Now, given I was able to find photos of this building online, I doubt this is the case, but regardless, I hope the boy, if he was real, has found his rest. So this is Sprucevale. If you want to see it for yourself, all you need to do is take a drive over to Beaver Creek State Park. It's waiting for you. I hate to say it, but the worst school tragedy in the history of the United States occurred in Ohio, in a town named Collinwood. The setting for this tragedy was a school that's nowadays referred to as the Collinwood School, but it was actually named Lakeview School. And this school was designed in such a way that if it were to catch fire, well, it would have basically been a chimney, sucking flames upwards through the structure as the wooden interior burned away, with only 2 exits to save unexpected visitors from the fire's wrath. And regarding that fire, it happened. The date of the fire was March 4th of 1908. It's speculated that on this day, the building's janitor, who was supposedly known for being careless, may have left a boiler running hotter than he should have, or that some of the girls attending the school may have been smoking in the basement closet, but according to the coroner at least, the cause was probably heat pipes running too close to the wooden joists in the building, and suddenly they may have ignited. It's worth noting at the time, folks generally thought this cause may have been a sign so that nobody in particular would be held accountable for the tremendous loss of life that occurred in the fire that day. Ultimately, whatever the cause was, the fire spread really quickly, and due to the few exits in the building, the adults and children running for the exits were stopped in their tracks, as there was traffic at the doors. This led to individuals falling over, and eventually falling on top of each other, creating a literal pile of people that blocked both exits and pinned individuals against nearby walls. This was compounded by the fact that Collinwood only had a small fire department and slow horse-drawn fire engines that were all poorly equipped to even put out a fire when they arrived, well after it had started. All told, this event claimed the lives of nearly half of the children in the building and 2 teachers, totaling 174 individuals. In a macabre turn of events, it didn't take long for the city of Collinwood to rebuild either, and only about 2 years later, in 1910, a new school was built literally right next to the site of the old school, named the Collinwood Memorial School, with a memorial garden being built on the site of the old school. This decision was met with a lot of pushback, but despite this, the school was indeed built and attended steadily through the 1970s, and when it was shut down, and to this day, the structure remained abandoned, at least by the living, that is. Folks that live near the Collinwood School claim that sometimes, despite the fact that this building is abandoned and presumably has no power, a light will occasionally appear on the 2nd floor, and it will gradually travel the halls of the school. Some have been brave enough to venture inside of the abandoned school upon seeing this light, only to hear something in the distance that they think might be calling out to them. But as they grow closer, what they originally perceived as voices are clearly multiple people. And they're not speaking, they're actually screaming for help. And that light, from one comment I saw on a forum regarding the school, they say it's not just some ball of light traveling the school, that it's actually a small ball of fire. Now, in the midst of this sad tale, we can at least take some solace in the fact that tragedies like these throughout history were stark lessons in what not to do in tense situations, and how not to design buildings. Because of this, fire codes and preventative measures improved across the country. Now, I'm not sure if this is true, but some stories say that this event was actually one of the strongest points of inspiration for the modern fire drills that we have today. Surprisingly, the first hospital on this list is the Edwin Shaw Hospital, or as it was once known, the Springfield Lake Sanatarium. This sanitarium was opened in 1915 in Lakemore, Ohio, outside of Akron, along the aptly named Sanatarium Road. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know that being a sanitarium in the 1900s means that this place housed tuberculosis patients, and TB was so rampant in the region that every county was actually required to have its own TB treatment facility at the time in Ohio. Like many, this sanitarium was designed to give the patients that were destined to pass from TB a sense of calm in their few remaining days or years. And this hospital was exclusively operated for these patients until 1959, when Ohio passed legislation to allow doctors at the hospital to treat other patients too. As was typical of TB sanatoriums, patients weren't always older. Many younger individuals are also buried on site because of this, in a small cemetery located on the hospital's campus, with the individuals who passed there being denoted by numbers rather than names. Apparently this was typical for TB sanitariums. In addition to housing TB patients, this hospital also had an area called the Sunshine Village, which housed orphaned, abused, and neglected children, rather than those afflicted with TB. From what I can tell, this particular part of the hospital wasn't in operation independently for long and was adopted under the rest of the hospital's wing in the 1960s until it was closed in 1985. Now, with the opening of a new facility in 2009 that shared the same responsibilities, the state of Ohio left Edwin Shaw Hospital behind and demolished it fully in 2017. Despite the fact that there were bids to turn the hospital into many other types of facilities, including a year-round historical attraction or even a haunted attraction for tourists. Now, despite the hospital being demolished, to this day folks still claim that if you're brave, you can see the patients wandering the premises of the torn-down place. To start, there are nearly 250 individuals buried in the hospital cemetery, housing tuberculosis patients, but also children that were part of the Sunshine Village that passed away by their own hands. It's said that a late-night visit to the cemetery and the woods next to the cemetery can yield strange experiences. These include cold spots, and also they say that if you're to take a photo, you might find an odd haze to be hanging over the photograph in certain parts of the woods. One of the most chilling stories is actually by an ex-security guard. Apparently this man was patrolling the property, and he actually saw a young woman walking around at the edge of the forest on the property, and he approached her, and then she retreated into the woods. He followed her, of course, being a good Samaritan, and what happened next scared him half to death. He heard a voice, not coming from in front of him, but rather on his radio. It was a young girl's voice, and she asked, "Can I go home?" To which he said, not even over the radio. He said, "Yes, you can go home, your family's waiting for you." And over the radio he heard, "Thank you, bye-bye." Holy shoot, if that happened to me, I would be running for the hills and wearing diapers for a few days. Now, to be serious, regarding the hospital itself, while it's no longer standing, folks that used to visit the hospital prior to it being demolished would also report doors opening on their own, and often they'd drive by in their cars and they'd see silhouettes of individuals looking out of the windows. Also, empty hallways would sometimes be filled with footsteps, and occasionally in the children's area, the Sunshine Village, you could hear children humming tunes. Now, this next ghost might be the most well-known individual on this list, the 20th U.S. President, James A. Garfield. So in Cleveland, Ohio, there's a cemetery named Lakeview Cemetery. I know we've already covered cemeteries, but this is more about the memorial than the cemetery itself. But here there's a huge memorial to the assassinated President, James A. Garfield. This was built starting in October of 1885 and was designed based on Byzantine Gothic and Romanesque revival styles. The monument is the final resting place of not just President Garfield, but also his wife and two other family members. Now, a bit of history on Garfield. He was the Republican presidential nominee in his time and sort of a rags-to-riches story that many looked up to. He was literally born into a log cabin in Moreland Hills, Ohio. In his early life, his father actually passed away, leaving him poor and fatherless, and he actually apparently took to literature, viewing his education as a way out of his peril, eventually ending up at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, a place I know pretty well, where he got an excellent education which set him up for the rest of his life. During the Civil War, Garfield fought on the side of the Union and actually became a major general, and afterwards he served in Ohio in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1863 to 1881. In 1880, the Republican Party chose Garfield as its nominee, and he went on to win the general election that year. Now, whatever your stance on Garfield, he was ultimately assassinated in 1881 by one Charles Guiteau, a 39-year-old man that was known to be emotionally disturbed and perhaps narcissistic and perhaps even schizophrenic. He attacked Garfield because Garfield refused to appoint him as his European consult. Guiteau stalked him for a number of weeks, purchased a pew-pew, and knowing his location, because at the time presidential movements were very poorly obscured, waited for him in the ladies' room of a train station where, once Garfield arrived, Guiteau simply walked up to him and pew-pewed him twice. Now, Garfield didn't immediately pass away from these wounds. He actually lasted about 3 months, but in this day and age, before antibiotics, he was helpless to combat the infection that came for him following these wounds. And being a native to Moreland Hills, Ohio, Garfield expressed his wishes to be buried in Lakeview Cemetery in his home state. And this leaves us where we are today, with Garfield buried in what is often referred to as America's first mausoleum. Frankly, the place is gorgeous. It's got an opulent design and artwork depicting the life of Garfield, surrounded by stained glass windows, mosaic tiles, and marble stairs, all positioned surrounding a marble statue of James A. Garfield. There's also stairways that lead to an observation deck, a ballroom, a balcony, and also some locations that are not known by the general public. Now, as you'd expect with Garfield being buried here, folks seem to think his ghost still lingers here, conveniently ignoring that he's also claimed to frequent his former home in Hiram and the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as the White House. Frankly, most of the claims about his hauntings are fairly pedestrian, largely with folks seeing Garfield wander the tomb in the corner of their eye, or even seeing him late at night, staring off into the cemetery from the mausoleum's balcony. There's even the odd account of individuals having conversations with a man who seems a bit out of place, only to take a look at the Garfield statue later on in their visit and nearly faint when they realize they'd been talking to the ghost of an ex-president. Most entertaining to me, though, is the account I've seen that, if you're astute and come at the right time, you might see a couple of people walking around the cemetery late at night, literally moving tombstones around, ripping them out of the ground and placing them elsewhere. Some may immediately think that these are vandals at work until they get closer and they get a good look at the individuals doing this. Not only will they find that these individuals are ghosts, but they're actually the ghosts of President Garfield and John Rockefeller. Oh, and what are they doing? They're apparently playing chess with the tombstones. East of Cleveland, towards the Pennsylvania border, there's a tiny town with a little library located next to a Masonic temple that's referred to as the Kingsville Library. The library was established in its present location in 1918, so it's been around the block a few times. Frankly, this story is pretty short, but generally speaking, it's believed that this library is haunted by a man in a tall hat that walks between the bookshelves and occasionally picks up a book that he likes. And he'll take a look at it, turn a few pages, before dropping it on the floor with a heavy thud. In one account I read online, the curtains to the closed children's room of the library would sometimes open late at night, apparently so that the tall-hatted man could gaze outside. As I said, this tale is short. There's no speculation on who this might have been in life either, or what events led to the man in the tall hat's passing, but I thought it worth mentioning since I'm trying to be comprehensive here. The Erie Canal is a historic east-west canal that runs from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and it was the first navigable waterway connecting the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. It was mainly built to reduce the price of transportation for goods and services as well as people across the Appalachians, and it was a key part of settling the Great Lakes region and expanding America westward. Its construction was completed in 1825, and at the time it was one of the marvels of engineering of the modern world. Now, despite this praise, there is an odd saying about the Erie Canal I read a couple of times in my research on Ohio. It's, "For every mile of the canal, an Irishman is buried," in reference to the fact that the dangerous work of building the canal involved primarily Irish immigrants who passed away in falls and accidents, sure, but even more often, due to malaria, dysentery, and other diseases they picked up in the moist environment of the canals. The shifts these workers did were usually 12 hours, and this wasn't 12 hours at a desk chair. No, it was terrible and grueling work with lackluster living conditions. It's no wonder there were plenty of strikes and revolts during the building of the canal. This all leads to our story here, about Erie Canal's Lock 4. See, at this site, it's said that during the canal's construction, a group of Irishmen heard a rumor that Lock 4 was not to be completed and that soon they'd be out of work, or maybe that the canal they were working on would be shut down. Apparently, the man who was in charge of the operation caught wind of this rumor and got so heated that he started spewing the workers working there, and afterwards, ultimately himself, with highly concentrated acid that they had on site. Now, not all of the workers who got hit with this acid passed away, but many were burned, and the man in charge, well, perhaps rightfully, he didn't make it. It's said that because of this, today, if you visit Lock 4, which is now part of a park open in Ohio devoted to the preservation of places where the Erie Canal ran, and you're there late at night, you might see a man wandering the property who's disfigured and extremely angry looking. One account I read online claimed that he might see you from a distance and angrily yell, "Get back to work," before fading away into the night. Near Dayton, just a little ways to the southeast, there's a town named Bellbrook. Some apparently refer to this area as Ohio's own Sleepy Hollow, and it's said that the activity here ramps up substantially if you go near a little place in the town named Maggie Park. Now, Maggie Park is quite small. There's a playground and some woods, and it's only about 4 acres in total. But what you don't see at face value is what happened here way back in the day to give this area its moniker of Sleepy Hollow. So, living around the area in a cabin on a creek named Little Sugar Creek, there was a man named James Buckley. He operated a sawmill on his property, and it grew from a tiny business venture into a full-fledged business, making him relatively wealthy for the region. But back in the day, rich folks didn't have alarm systems in their homes or anything, so when some thieves got wind of the riches to be had in James' home, they decided to pay him a visit. The next day, some folks got curious because James didn't show up to work, and they got the cops interested, and the cops paid a visit to his house, only to find that when they arrived, they found James at home, but he was missing his head. According to the sources I'm reading, James' head was actually never found. This led to his cabin that he lived in developing a reputation for being haunted. Now, of course, as with all haunted homes, some folks got curious about the legends and decided they should go check out the cabin to see if the legend was true. And a few of these curious or perhaps dumb explorers reported that when they entered the premises of James' home, they were met with a ghost that was missing his head, with his arms stretched out towards them as if asking for their help in finding his head, maybe. Some folks were even dumb enough to rent the darn cabin, and sure enough, they saw James too. This time, he had his head. It was neatly tucked underneath his arms. These days, the cabin is gone, but that doesn't stop reports of late-night park-goers seeing a headless individual roaming in the woods of Maggie Park. Now, the Little Sugar Creek, or Maggie Park area, has another story to tell too. This one's of a young girl who ended her own life in the 1880s around this park. Some folks actually say the woman here was a servant girl, and she was sleeping with her master, who happened to be a local politician. Some say the mayor of Bellbrook, to be precise. Now, this activity caught up to them, and she ended up pregnant, and as you'd expect, the mayor wanted nothing to do with this child and actually fired her from her position. Because of this, the young woman actually turned to begging, and then to being a working girl, if you catch my drift, and ultimately, at least according to the story, she had the child. Now, life was tough on her after this, and she was finding it extremely hard to make a living, and on top of all of this, according to the woman's account, the child looked a whole lot like its father, making her resent the baby. At one point, this all became too much. The fact that the child resembled its father, the horrible tough job she had to do, and the whispers of the judgmental community, all of it. And because of this, she took her child with her to a bridge overlooking Little Sugar Creek, which was at the time named Possum Creek. Briefly, she sang to her child, she took a deep breath, and she jumped into the water below. Now, if you believe the stories, a few days later, the body of the woman was found, and she was clutching something. It was a heap of blankets, and curiously, there was no baby inside. This led some to speculate that the woman may have been insane and never had a child in the first place. Despite this, there's an eerie sight that's often reported at night in this park. The sight of a slightly translucent young woman singing lullabies to a bundle of blankets that she holds in her arms. Now, speaking of another president, on April 14th of 1865, Abraham Lincoln was ended by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was mourned across the nation and perhaps around the world, and ultimately, on April 18th, Lincoln's body was put on a train that brought him across the nation from Washington, D.C. to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, there were apparently lines of people who played music, sung hymns, and lit bonfires in his honor. And on April 29th, his body ended up passing through Urbana, Ohio. And because of this, there's an urban legend that the ghostly image of this train that carried Lincoln's body charges through the town every year on April 29th at night. Now, this legend is fairly simple and pretty much just that, and I've pretty much done the whole job of describing it. But if you want to take part in this ritual of lining up to see the Lincoln funeral train, well, I have good news for you. You won't be alone. Every year, it's said that at least about 100 folks line up in Urbana on April 29th to test the urban legend at dusk and see if, maybe, the train might stop by for them in honor of one of the most notable presidents in United States history. Earlier in this video, we discussed a sad case of a fire in a school that influenced national policy on the design and construction of buildings in the case of fires to limit fatalities. Here we're going to discuss a story that is spiritually kind of similar, but its influence was on bridge building and the transport of goods and people by trains. The story takes place in Ashtabula, Ohio, in December of 1876. On a bridge that passes over the Ashtabula River just east of the city. This bridge was designed by the Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula Railroad, and this company, by its own account, admitted that this iron bridge, which they'd just built to replace a wooden bridge, was somewhat experimental. Although it wasn't the first of its kind, with even this particular company having built iron bridges over rivers and canals previously. Now, it's worth noting that this bridge was sort of destined to fail. The designers of the bridge actually gave their plans to another bridge builder and designer at one point, one Joseph Tomlinson, and this individual actually concluded that there were serious design flaws that would compromise the bridge's ability to hold live loads, such as trains. Tomlinson suggested making changes to the bridge to make it safer, which the company and designer refused, actually firing Tomlinson from the project and actually apparently making the changes he suggested anyways. Regardless, the bridge was not ready for the loads it was going to accept, with the whole structure relying on just 12 beams and posts. Now, if this didn't sound bad enough already, the night of the incident in question, there was a blizzard hitting the region with more than 20 inches of snow having fallen on the ground, and there were also strong winds of up to 54 miles an hour this day that were turning already tall piles of snow into legitimate snowdrifts on the railroad tracks. The train in question was train number 5 of the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway, which was actually the same company that designed the bridge, just in a later form with a new name, and it left Buffalo at about 2 p.m., an hour behind schedule, with a second engine to help it plow through the snowdrifts. The train had 2 baggage cars, 2 passenger coaches, and 2 express coaches, as well as a drawing room car for sleeping and a smoking car. Reports vary, but it's thought that about 150 to 200 people were on the train. As the train approached Cleveland and was just reaching Ashtabula and passed over the river at about 15 miles per hour with snow falling so hard that accounts claim there was zero visibility, suddenly, according to records, one of the engineers heard a crack and felt the train start to slowly descend. He realized at this point the bridge was collapsing, and in response he tried to get over the bridge by pushing the train to full throttle. But the connection between the 2 engine cars snapped, and while the first engine was able to make it over the bridge, the latter was not, with the 11 cars behind it falling down into the Ashtabula River, the bridge itself following the train down into the ravine. According to reports, the whole scene was a mess. To give you an idea of how bad it was, not only was the fall about 154 feet at maximum, but trains were not just falling into the ravine, they were crashing into each other at the bottom. It's actually thought that many passengers survived the initial fall, only to be crushed by the preceding trains, such as the smoking car, which is thought to have taken out the first passenger car, which otherwise may have been mostly full of survivors. Obviously, this scene drew many rescuers, such as employees of the railroad company and residents of Ashtabula themselves. It's accounted that folks brought axes with them, hoping to break apart the wooden train cars and free survivors in them, though these efforts were mostly in vain, as the coal and kerosene heating stoves and oil lamps in the overturned cars were quickly catching aflame. A lucky few passengers were able to escape, but most of those in the wreckage passed away within 20 minutes, according to reports. Apparently, the response wasn't helped by the somewhat horrifying fact that the Ashtabula Fire Brigade's chief was a raging alcoholic, and apparently no orders were given to even fight the flames of the fire, claiming there was no use in doing so. This left townspeople themselves to start grabbing buckets of water to try to put out the flames. On top of this, let's also not forget these trains were trapped in a river, which is full of water, cold water, in December, so it was thought that many of the individuals who were trapped in the train cars, they drowned. Following the crash, injured were dragged into town by sleds and sleighs, and placed in the railroad engine house, the nearby Eagle Hotel, and even in residences nearby. The town didn't even have a hospital to help the victims of the crash. It took about until midnight for the surviving individuals to get to safety, and even longer to get extra help from Cleveland, the nearest major city with adequate resources to aid in this disaster. To make matters doubly worse, it's said that thieves caught wind of this event and actually started to steal valuables from not just the victims of the crash, but the crash site itself. All told, it's estimated that between 87 and 200 individuals passed away, with an official count of 92 deceased and 64 injured. There's a lot of uncertainty in what the actual number was, though, due to the insane extent of the crash and the fire, which together masked the remains and broke many of them apart, causing many of the bodies of those involved to be partial, with many of those that passed away being identified by valuable items they had on their person rather than actual body parts. Now on to the ghosts that followed this tragedy. Many of the victims were buried in Chestnut Grove Cemetery, nearby. Specifically, those unidentified were thrown into a mass grave, which is these days denoted by a monument to those lost. It's said that because of this, the spirits of these unknown deceased individuals haunt the site. And if you see a well-dressed person in old-timey clothing wandering around the cemetery, perhaps looking aimless, you might have encountered one of them. There's also the scene of the accident, which is said to be haunted on the anniversary of the dastardly event on December 29th every year. Folks claim that if you go where the bridge once stood and look down into the river, you might be met with the sounds of screams and pleads for help. And one comment I saw on Facebook even claimed that right at the moment of the crash, the river will turn red before your eyes. Now, these days, there is obviously no longer this bridge there. It collapsed, of course, but Chestnut Grove Cemetery and the monument to those that passed are still there. Folks still go to the spot, as well as to the river on the anniversary of the crash, to, in a macabre fashion, look for those long-gone souls that may still wander the area. Additionally, perhaps eerily, every now and then a piece of rail, or what looks to be a part of a train, are actually found in the Ashtabula River around the site of the crash. And according to legends, it's said that these small pieces are what the souls of those that passed away still cling to, and why the place is so haunted. If you know Cleveland, you'll know that it went through a rough period with a lot of crime in the early 1900s. And it's from one of these crimes that the urban legend of Black Marianne appears. Around the area that is today the West Side Market on West 25th Street, sort of near Great Lakes Brewing Company, one of the alleys is supposedly haunted by an event that occurred in the 1930s. If you believe the legend, a woman named Marianne was attacked in one of these alleys, and, well, she didn't make it home. Whoever perpetrated this attack was never found, but as the story goes, Marianne, while having passed away, isn't necessarily gone. These days, folks that walk around these alleys late at night occasionally now report that they've sighted a woman dressed in all black clothing walking through the alley. And in the event that someone notices her and tries to have a conversation with her, she generally just stands there, motionless, not making a single sound. Additionally, there's a twist on this tale that says that Black Marianne apparently finds purpose in the afterlife in preventing others from meeting the same fate she did. In one account from the 1973 book Ohio's Ghostly Greats, author David Garrick recounts an instance where one person reported that Black Marianne saved another young woman who found herself in peril in the same alley she was attacked. Now, I'm not going to discount your experience if you've seen this ghost, but I can at least say that if there is a ghost in this alley, she was probably not named Marianne. Don't get me wrong, Cleveland was rough for a long time. Even Eliot Ness spent time there, and Great Lakes Brewery has a beer named after him because he spent so much time there. I know too much about this brewery, I know, I've mentioned it in 2 videos now, but I digress. Regardless, to this day, even nice places are home to terrible things. An attack like this surely could have happened that gave rise to Black Marianne. I'm just saying there's no unsolved you-know-what of a woman with the name Marianne in Cleveland in either of these alleys, or really from the 1930s time period in general. So personally, I'm calling this myth busted, but what do you think? Do you think Black Marianne is real? Do you have a story? Let me know about it in the comments. So this next story is also a short one, and frankly, it's going to be tough to show you actual photos relevant to it, as the haunted place that this story takes place in has actually sort of crumbled away, with ghosts apparently now haunting the woods near the site, and the area next to the Scioto River instead. In short though, in the 1800s, there were many trappers located throughout Ohio, and along with this drove of trappers moving into the state came a man named Joe Robinson. At first, folks thought he was a trapper too, but they noticed after a little while, not only was he not doing much trapping, but he was also constantly carrying large sacks around with him. Now, it didn't take long for folks to figure out these sacks were full of gold, as quickly it became known in the region that Robinson had purchased a bunch of land overlooking a valley in what is today Delaware County, Ohio, with gold. This was followed by the delivery of European furniture that was hand-carved and a castle appearing on the overlook of this valley. Apparently the place was a genuine palace, if only there were any real records of the home. Accounts are limited though, in part because Robinson was supposedly very reclusive, only letting a few select people from the town into his home, and these select few people reported that the house was actually filled with, most notably, paintings, and that Robinson claimed to have painted these paintings himself. One of these paintings is what actually fuels the fire of the legend we hear about today, and that is that all the gold that Robinson got, well, he got it from theft, and that was because he was a pirate. Because where else does gold come from but from robbing ships when you're a pirate? Anyways, according to those that saw this painting, it was of the deck of a ship, with pirates aboard, and in the middle of them was painted a man that supposedly looked a ton like Robinson himself. Eventually, among all of the things that were delivered to Robinson's home was a woman. They say she was beautiful, and the way she was dressed made the locals speculate that she might have even been European royalty. When she wasn't in the castle, it's said that her favorite thing to do was to walk along the Scioto River. This only lasted a little while, though, as after a short period of time, this woman disappeared. Folks stopped seeing her. Then they got speculative about what happened to her, and this led to a group of locals going to the mansion and demanding of Robinson that he let the woman go or tell them what happened to her. But when the locals got there, they found that Robinson was gone too. They searched the house, and they found signs of a struggle, a bloody handprint on the walls to be precise, and above this handprint there was a painting of that beautiful woman. At first they looked at it and they just stopped in awe, and then suddenly they saw the face on the painting begin to quiver, and it looked like it was going to speak to them. This scared the hell out of them, of course, and so they started running. Now, after this, it's said that sometimes the beautiful woman started being seen again wandering the banks of the Scioto River, but this time she was transparent because, according to the legends, she was a ghost. Additionally, folks to this day report not only the transparent woman, but also that in the woods where John Robinson's house was, that they can hear screaming on certain nights. So, as you know, now I'm going to do my best to tell you the truth of this tale. The home, or mansion or castle or whatever you want to say it was very much real, and it was in Concord Township in Delaware County. To this day, there are some remains, apparently, although the photo I was able to find of these remains is absolutely lousy, but I'll show it here anyways. But perhaps the most pressing question of all is, who was John Robinson, and was he really a pirate? Well, the answer is not really. Reality is generally less exciting than these stories I tell, and John's reality is that he was born in London in 1802, and he came to America in 1834. I don't know why this wasn't part of the story, but factually speaking, he was at first a farmer, but he got malaria that made him too feeble to farm, so he took to making art and carving wood. And some of the paintings he made are actually fantastic, and they're supposedly still hung in the Nash House Museum in Delaware, Ohio. And by the way, when he moved to the USA, he brought his family, and from what I can tell, there was no grand scandal with a woman getting murked in his home. So once again, we're busting this myth. Maybe John or his wife's ghost haunt the banks of the Scioto or the woods near their home, but it doesn't look like anything tragic or dramatic happened. Just a man who moved with his family to America, seeking a better life. Did you know that Ohio was home to what is claimed to be the only haunted carousel in the world? Carved in 1917 by one American artist, Daniel C. Muller, because of his love for Civil War and pre-World War II cavalry mounts, the horse was apparently, for a long time, stationed on a carousel at Cedar Point Park for all to ride. But of everyone that rode it, it was supposedly loved the most by Muller's wife, Louisa. If you believe the stories, Louisa would ride this horse as often as she could, and she loved it to the point of borderline jealousy and anger when others rode it in her place. Because of this, there's a pervading legend that sometimes at night in Cedar Point, you'll see a woman riding a carousel as it runs on its own without any operator. Folks say that this is the apparition of Daniel Muller's wife. There's also an urban legend that photographs can't be taken of the horse because they're fogged over by Louisa. Frankly, this one is pretty easy to disprove because I've indeed seen photos of this horse. Now, the only issue I could find with this urban legend is that, well, according to ghostofohio.org, the horse that was once on the carousel is no longer on the carousel. It's actually in a museum named the Frontier Town Museum near the back of Cedar Point Park. And it's in the museum's basement, and in its stead, on the carousel, is a replica of this horse. Which, it sort of makes sense. Why let guests who don't know any better ride a timeless piece of art? But I digress. If Louisa is still riding the carousel at Cedar Point, maybe she just doesn't mind that she's riding on a replica. Next, we have one of those classic tales that college students or maybe high schoolers might tell when they're bored to drag their friends or love interests out to a secluded spot to get scared together. And that's the story of the Blue Flame Ghost. This story is set in Sugar Grove, Ohio, a super tiny town that, per the 2020 census, only had a population of just over 400 people. It's said that in this town there was a woman who was known for her beautiful wide smile and her love of life, but that this love for life evaporated when she became engaged to a man with a bad reputation and a mean temper. Quickly, folks all over town reported that the two were frequently seen arguing to the point of near violence, and one night they argued so badly that on a drive through the countryside, specifically beside the Hummel-covered bridge, they stopped their car to fight it out, and the woman snapped. She, right there, turned her soon-to-be husband into a headless soon-to-be husband, and apparently in the act somehow hurt herself too. Once the deed was done, she apparently wasn't in good sorts and grabbed her husband's head and walked down the hill beside the bridge with it, and eventually collapsed at the bottom of a ravine, where her body was found the next day. Now, these days, the bridge in question no longer exists in the form it did. Now it's a concrete bridge, but despite this, it's said that if you stand on the modern bridge and call out the name of the woman, which admittedly I could not find a consistent name for her, it's said that the blue silhouette of a woman will appear at the top of the nearby hill, and that she'll slowly walk down to you. So I looked high and low for factual reports of this sort of crime occurring in the 1930s in Sugar Grove, and, maybe I stink at researching this stuff, but I must admit, I don't see anything worth noting. The bridge was definitely real, and sure, this certainly could have happened, but from what I can tell, this is kind of just a crybaby bridge story that kids keep spreading to have fun, and frankly, I don't have any problem with that, but I don't think that the event that this urban legend is tied to actually occurred. So, this one's a bit different. Have you ever heard of those stories about places where animals go to pass away? Places that elephants, or bison, or even in this case wolves, might go in their final days to pass away where their kin passed away long ago. Well, this story of Old Raritan, it's a sad story, but it's also a story about one of these fantastical places. I'll be the first to admit that, at least from what I've gathered, there isn't any definite location for this tale. All that modern people seem to know is that this occurred somewhere in modern-day Pike County, Ohio. According to locals, there was a rock there named Great Buzzard's Rock, or even Big Rock, and gray wolves would go to the top of this rock in their final days and linger there before passing away. Along with this urban legend came two things. One was the hunting of the gray wolf population to near extinction because they were attacking settlers' livestock, and another was a large gray wolf they referred to as Old Raritan that, no matter how many times they tried to fell, never seemed to pass away. They'd corner him, and they'd pew-pew him, and they'd poison him, but they'd always see him again, roaming the countryside with his mate. Apparently, eventually, there came a fateful day, though, where they actually caught Old Raritan's mate, and some hunters with their dogs were able to do a number on her. But just as they were about to finish her off, Old Raritan himself came flying out of the woods and ended the dogs, attacking his mate, and then attacked the hunters too. During this attack, though, Raritan was pew-pewed and bitten dozens of times. The hunters eventually retreated, but from a distance afterwards, they watched to see if they'd done the job. In the distance, they saw that Raritan took his mate and dragged her to the top of Big Rock, where she passed away, before letting out a loud howl and falling down himself, finally having been put to rest as the last two gray wolves in Ohio. These days in Pike County, Ohio, it's actually said that on a dark, moonless night, you can hear the thunderous cry of wolves in the woods, and if you somehow did stumble upon Big Rock, you'd be met with Old Raritan himself, standing guard over the place where most of his species spent their final days. If you're a fan of taking a drive and maybe stopping for a bit on a lover's lane, and you live in Ross County, Ohio, be warned. There's someone there who, in the afterlife, isn't a fan of all of that fun you're having, and his name is Enos Kay. As the story goes, Enos Kay lived in the village of Egypt Pike in Ross County, Ohio, and he'd recently managed to get a young woman named Elvira to promise him her hand in marriage. He was ecstatic, and plans were being made for a wedding. That is until 1869, when they attended their church's picnic, and an unknown man was there. This man apparently quickly took a fancy to Elvira, and had the lack of decency to actually woo Elvira right in front of Enos at this picnic, to his dismay. The next day, Elvira was actually seen holding hands with this unknown man, and then a couple of days later, she was said to have run off with him through her bedroom window in the middle of the night to elope together. Enos frankly didn't believe the story at first, but he went to fetch Elvira, and when he got to her house, he found that she was gone, and he was heartbroken. Because of this, he swore to haunt happy young lovers until Judgment Day, and then ended his own, he ended himself. Apparently this happened near a bridge that was a local lover's lane. Because of this, these days, if you're lover's laning in Ross County, Ohio, it's said that you might hear something on your car, and if you look out the windows or maybe your sunroof, you'll see the face of Enos Kay judging you with a horrible grin on his face. One fun note to this legend, he'll only do this to you if you're happy. It's said that if you stop because you're in a fight or something by a lover's lane, you're safe, funny enough. Passing over Sugar Creek along Schultz Portage Road in Elmore, Ohio, there's a bridge that is claimed to be haunted and sort of to be the home of a spooklight, like the Joplin Spooklight or the Hooker Man we've covered in previous states. As this urban legend goes, on March 21st back in the day, a soldier returned home from war and excitedly boarded his motorcycle to go see his girlfriend. But when he arrived at her home, he found that she was in bed with another man. Furious, he took off as fast as he could back towards home, feeling betrayed. But as he was passing over this bridge, he misjudged his speed, and he took a turn too fast and he went off the side of the road into a barbed wire fence, which removed his head. For a while, this legend sparked a tale that if you went to the bridge on March 21st and you flashed your headlights 3 times, a ghost light would appear and drive by your car. Admittedly, this sort of urban legend was more popular decades ago than today, but in 1969, one Richard Gill tried this legend and came up with a compelling enough story to keep this urban legend alive to this day. As the story goes, Richard Gill and his friend drove out to the bridge on March 21st, and 3 times they were able to successfully summon the spooklight. First, the spooklight just rode by. The second time, he laid down a bit of tape, and he found that the tape was undisturbed after the spooklight passed over it. And so the third time, Richard sent his friend out to stand in the path of the light when the light passed by. And suddenly, when that happened, his friend was gone. He ran around looking for his friend and finally found him at the bottom of a nearby ditch. His friend was alive, but he was totally disoriented and confused about how he got there. And this story sparked enough attention to keep this legend alive. Now, admittedly, if you do some digging, you'll have a tough time finding out whether or not this individual who drove off the road was even true, and there's even conflicting accounts claiming that this bridge is actually a nearby bridge in town that passes over the Portage River instead, but hey, that's folklore for you. If you've had any of your own experiences with this spooklight, let me know in the comments though. Holy guacamole, folks, that was the longest video I've ever recorded. Ohio is certainly haunted, and the variety of well-established ghost stories there dwarf any state I've seen so far. With all of this being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, a like, a comment, and even your subscription would mean the world to me. And it'd help tell YouTube that I deserve a little more watch time. I promise it'll never cost you a dime either. With all of this being said, whether you're walking through a cemetery and you see a horseshoe on a grave, or if you see friggin' President Andrew Garfield staring at you from the balcony of his monument, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.